Hey everybody, this is Ted. Welcome back to week 2. This week we're going to be exploring two texts from classical Greece, which are Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics. Both these different texts, both the full books, played a foundational role in the development of Western European education, and we're starting class off with a quick trip through some educational history to kind of help build some context as we start moving into some more modern educational debates. And I wanted to um, look at these two particular texts because, having sort of talked a little bit about some themes, some eternal questions of education last week, I'm interested to see how you all take these readings and see what your reactions are to them. So, last week we kind of talked about Labourie's framework, which described education as a struggle between a public good for democratic equality and social efficiency, and a private good for social mobility. So today we're going to kind of see if there's maybe any overlaps here. Um, and one question we're just going to keep returning to over and over again in this class is, what is the purpose of education? And, you know, some people, I think Laborie included, argues that there might actually be multiple purposes. And in that case, what should the primary purpose be? So, we're going to start off with a discussion of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And to understand sort of some of the historical context going on around this time, I think it's important that we talk a little bit about a group of people called the Sophists. In Greece, a sort of group of educators emerged during the 5th century BC. They're called the Sophists, and their name was derived from the Greek word Sophia, which can be understood as wisdom or learning. You may have heard of philosophy. It's the same root word. uh, so these men were sort of a new type of intellectual in Greek life. They were professional educators. So they toured around the country. They'd offer instruction in different subjects, but they placed particular emphasis on public speaking and preparation for public and political life. And the increasing prosperity of Greek cities, especially Athens, had helped create a sort of demand for this kind of education as more people started to participate in democracy, and they were interested sort of in winning arguments, because, part of the whole thing of democracy is you have to get other people to agree with you to get anything done. So I think one thing that's important to note is that these sophists in particular didn't really belong to any sort of organization, as we might call it, or any particular school of thought. There was no sort of like rules that you had to follow necessarily to be a sophist. And in our sort of like modern contemporary context, we might understand them closer to being like tutors rather than teachers. Um, One thing that they did sort of share between them, though, was the view that education should be a practical tool, used for people to get individual, personal, or political success. Um, and to this end, many of the sophists also held that there was no like absolute truth. Truth was sort of a relative and subjective thing, and what really mattered was people's ability to win an argument and persuade your audience, because um, that was something that, actually affected everybody. And it wasn't sort of like a high in the sky kind of thing. So now that we've touched on the sophists, we can kind of look a little bit at Plato's Allegory of the Cave, which, as the sort of author surrounding the text, Bayer mentions, Plato believed in an absolute truth as opposed to a subjective one. And in this way, the allegory of the cave sort of serves as a metaphor for the process of education. The man in the story, we read about kind of, starts off in the cave in a darkness, and over time sort of escapes into the light, which is sort of like the truth of the objective world outside. The next really big twist that Plato gives us in the story is that even after having discovered the truth of the outside world, the man still feels a responsibility to return to the cave. And this is sort of Plato arguing that just possessing knowledge and wisdom isn't enough for personal fulfillment. Having that knowledge or wisdom means that you have a responsibility. And that responsibility is that you have to go share it with other people. So the man takes his knowledge of the outside world, goes back into the cave. We can sort of interpret this as sort of maybe a prototype of the public good argument that we've sort of been looking at, in modern American contexts. For Plato, the goal of education isn't necessarily about personal happiness. In the Republic, Plato talks about his concept of the ideal state or ideal city, and the people who are supposed to make all the decisions in the city are the philosopher kings, who are supposed to be the most enlightened, quote unquote. In another section of the Republic, Plato also describes the philosopher kings as sort of being compelled by responsibility to lead for the sake of stability and justice in this sort of ideal city. And it's not necessarily something that they should be happy about, but it's what they have to do to make sure that the city functions. In this system, in the city that Plato describes, education can serve as serve as a sorting mechanism, which is necessary for the public good and for the stability of the city, because it helps to put everybody in their rightful place. Education is supposed to train individuals for a specific role in society, and earlier in the Republic, Plato even argues that the system that his ideal system would actually separate children from their parents to help better prepare children for their specific role in society. Aristotle was a student of Plato's and was also interested in education for the sake of a public good, as we can see in this week's reading. However, while Plato was sort of emphasizing that education should be about a public good that sort of ensures that society is going to be efficient and well functioning, Aristotle is more concerned about what the purpose of society should be, what are the benefits for people of society. And he thinks that the goal of the state should be the good life, which he kind of defines as like a state of human flourishing. Um, he thinks that the state should be concerned about providing an education for individuals to ensure that they have all the tools necessary to live that good life. And education of each citizen is going to allow them to cultivate like positive, virtuous habits to reach that goal. This means that we should learn more than just practical skills. Aristotle mentions music in our little reading as a skill which is of importance, but not necessarily for like productive purposes. It's important because it makes us happy. It gives us enjoyment. Um, so, what are some maybe common themes or threads that we can draw from both of Plato and Aristotle? So, first off, it's important to remember both of them are still sort of responding to these sophists that exist who think that the purpose of education is about winning an argument or getting political office. Obviously, Plato and Aristotle think education's about more than that. While Plato's Allegory of the Cave is a little bit pessimistic because he's sort of saying, most people are going to remain like the prisoners living in the cave. They're going to think that shadows are, actual reality. They're, going to be blind to the truth. He still thinks that people have a responsibility to go back into the cave to help their fellow people, even if those people don't want it. Aristotle, on the other hand, is sort of making an argument that the state has a responsibility to serve its people. And that responsibility is to help them live the good life, or which is going to involve both useful or necessary skills as well as sort of like fulfilling pursuits, like doing things that make you happy in addition to doing things that are necessary. And those could be like music, art, or other things that we personally would find enjoyment in, maybe like good cooking. So secondly, another theme I think that we can pull out is that Plato believes that learning is a transformative process. So we think about the man who's escaping from the cave is passing out of darkness into light, and once you pass into light, you sort of have a new understanding of reality. This can be a difficult or a painful process, like when we turn the lights on at night, after, like just waking up in the middle of the night. We're blinking around. It takes us a little bit to kind of get where we need to be. Aristotle agrees with this, but I think he believes that this sort of transformation that education can give us starts first more of it as an unconscious thing, and it's less like all at once. He's basically saying that we have to start things sort of as a matter of habit before we actually like understand the logic behind some of these things. So both these thinkers sort of see education as like a holistic process, which is going to require more than just like our minds. It's going to require like our full engagement as people, like our attention, like as they would probably say you got to put like your soul into it. So finally, Plato and Aristotle approach the matter of education from both the perspective of the individual and society. But of course, these are going to be through different perspectives. Aristotle is going to argue that education has to be a communal project, which the goal is to produce citizens who can live happy, individual, good lives. And he praises Sparta in the reading for this kind of approach, but he says basically their issue is they overemphasize courage, and if you've seen it, 300, the movie, they're really, they're too big a fan of fighting, and they are less interested in, the other sort of like good components, like they need more music and stuff. So, Plato, on the other hand, the Allegory of the Cave is about a very sort of like individual process of learning. This is like a very deeply individual process. The guy's leaving on his own. He's coming to these realizations on his own. But even still, he has a duty to come back to his community and share with what he has learned. So for Plato, we might understand education as sort of an individual experience, but it's supposed to benefit society. So we are going to spend next week with a little bit more sort of like history of Western education, doing a couple more readings that's going to be a little bit more substantial. We're going to be reading a chapter or book of Rousseau's Emile, a partially abridged chapter of Wollstonecraft's Vindication, and a section of text from John Dewey, who is an American, but I wanted to sort of have him respond to some of the stuff going on from Wollstonecraft and Rousseau. And we're going to kind of use that to bookend our sort of journey through some history of Western education. So the next week is on the Enlightenment. And then we're going to start moving into post-colonial, early American education. So feel free, hopefully you guys take a look at this video. Tell me what your thoughts are on this. I'm still trying to make some improvements on the format, things like that. And if there's things that you guys have questions about, please make sure to leave them in the course in our quizzes so I can try to help improve what we're doing. So thank you.